Hello, all, and welcome. Last episode, we heard from Guido Minaya on the value that employee and business resource groups bring to large companies. In this next episode, we continue our conversation on ERG and BRGs in this series focused on the diversity and inclusion space, specifically looking at participating in an ERG, best practices, and allyship. Our moderator for this episode is Dr. Guido Minaya, CEO and Chief Learning Officer of Minaya Learning Global Solutions, and he is joined by Cecilia Chavez, President and CEO of Competitive Edge Consulting, which provides human resource training and consulting services nationwide to a variety of industries and organization levels. Stay tuned to learn more. Hello, Dr. Minaya, and welcome back to the show. We have a new guest today, Cecilia Chavez. Welcome, Cecilia. As a brief intro, Cecilia Chavez has more than 30 years of successful experience consulting and training with a laser focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, DE&I. She has also held positions as a DE&I Division Director and DEIB Senior Director. Cecilia lays the foundation for these roles based on goals set by the organizations, the Board of Directors, and the Executive Director. Cecilia brings expertise acquired from her work across the country with some major clients like Sodexo, took them from a class action lawsuit to best in class, listed as #1 on the Diversity Inc. top Fortune 500 companies list, Boeing, AT&T, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Rubbermaid, IBM, State Farm, Hospice of the Valley, Native American Child and Family Conference, People of Color Network, ASU, Buffalo State College, Colorado State University, Gonzaga University, Harvard University, Loyola Marymount University, and many others. Clearly, her work is focused on corporate, nonprofit, educational institutions, government, and healthcare. Wow, what a background. I am excited to hear more about ERGs and BRGs from the both of you. Dr. Minaya, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Dario. Cecilia, it is incredible to be having a conversation about anything, let alone ERGs and BRGs with you. And wow, what a background indeed. My goodness, we go way back when we were both involved in AT&T's ERG, HISPA. And I think you were out of the Phoenix chapter back then. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Wow. Yeah, that was at such a foundational point for me in terms of becoming involved in inclusion and diversity, and through of course our ERG HISPA. And could you share a little bit more about your background and how you became involved in the field, and what drives you?
Well, I would have to go back to Phoenix. I would have to go back to HISPA. That was really a pivotal point in my life where it just opened my mind to all kinds of possibilities. Number one, it opened my mind to a career that I wanted, because I would sit in workshops that we would have at our annual conferences. As you know, Guido, you led a lot of those conferences. And we would bring speakers in that were already in the DEI field. It just wasn't called that in the late 80s, early 90s. Nobody even knew what diversity meant, but they were very ahead of their time and progressive. I remember Dr. Samwood Betances from Puerto Rico talking to us about diversity. I remember Mark Ortiz de Candia talking to us about diversity, and I just couldn't get enough information about this. So then I had an opportunity to become a diversity consultant internally for AT&T, and I traveled the country training executives for 2 intensive days. And some of the stories I heard, especially from our executives of color, were so compelling that I just knew I had to do this work the rest of my life. So I put an exit strategy in place, and I did that in 1998 and left AT&T and started my own firm, just focusing on diversity, equity, and now inclusion and belonging and accessibility. So just keep adding the
Right.
the alphabet soup, but it keeps evolving in a good way for me.
Right. Oh, how exciting. And if you think back at your participation in HISPA, and I think this is just to set a little context for anyone that's in a large corporation where these types of organizations exist. What led you to participate in AT&T's HISPA ERG?
I think that was the first time in my life where I felt seen I felt heard, and I felt valued. And why that happened was even more than what the ERG brought me. But I came from a very small community in New Mexico, all dirt roads. I was related to everybody, one main road. And I remember when I first started my career with AT&T, if we had a Spanish-speaking customer, they would have to be transferred to American Airlines, who would translate their question, send it back to AT&T. We would give them, the result. They'd send it back to the customer and translate it. That would take sometimes 3 months. And I was appalled by that. And I thought, if my grandparents, who only spoke Spanish, called AT&T with a question on a phone bill, they'd have to wait 3 months for that answer. So I just started handling the calls myself and speaking in Spanish. And pretty soon I couldn't take breaks, I couldn't take lunches. And before you knew it, I was getting attention from our corporate offices in New Jersey, AT&T, saying what's going on in Phoenix. And they narrowed it down to my phone and found out what I had been doing. I thought I was going to get fired, and instead they had me start a bilingual center. And at first we hired 65 people in San Antonio, and they sent me out there to train them. And then they hired 2,000 people in El Paso, and they still couldn't contain the call volumes. So because of my background, because of the ERG that gave me confidence to show up in my full self and be the Latina that I am, I was able to create a whole new business line for AT&T.
My goodness.
That's
Wow.
the value a BRG or ERG brings to a corporation.
Absolutely. And again, not with your manager, your manager's manager, or your senior VP directing you. It was something that you found a major gap in and found a way to solve for it. Wow. Incredible. Incredible. No, that's exciting. It's interesting, right? That those kinds of opportunities exist, I'm sure, in many companies in different ways that they address their markets, their customer base. So let's talk a little bit about present day ERG, BRG best practices that you've seen, and what are some practices, whether it's establishing or running effective ERGs, BRGs that you've been exposed to?
Well, I think the first key is that they are created by the very people that want to be in them, and they aren't imposed on groups. So let's say that, you're Asian in an organization and there aren't a lot of people in executive positions that look like you, but there are maybe some, entry level employees, middle level employees that you have an affinity with. You may want to charter a ERG. And so you would, pretty much fill out the paperwork, the process that's already been put in place by the organization. Now, the starting point is that every executive has to buy into this, support this, and usually an executive is a sponsor of a BRG or ERG. And so there's that immediate support that's already in place. You create your group. You begin with a governance structure. It can start with who's your executive sponsor, who is your chair. You may have some co-chairs, who are your members. You may go into roles and responsibilities, put together a playbook that really speaks to how you're going to handle events, training, mentoring, and you certainly want to put a plan together. And I would recommend starting with at least a 3-year plan as to what you want to accomplish and how are you going to measure your results. And those measurements are critical to show the value you bring to the organization and other employees. And oftentimes it could be a mentoring program that you're initiating for other Asian employees in this example. And you show how many people you're mentoring and how successful the program's going. And And those results can be published, and goals can be set around that. So it's really about taking your actions, your activities, and turning them into data to show the value that you are bringing to others and to your organization, because it has to be connected to the business. Your goals should be aligned with the business. And I think more importantly, you're helping the business retain employees because they have a sense of belonging. You're helping new employees get oriented to an organization they're unfamiliar with because they have affinity with your group. And it also goes beyond just having an affinity with the group. I've always recommended that every employee should join at least two groups. One group that they have affinity with, but a group that they know the least about, or maybe feel the most uncomfortable with. And that way, if their interest is to go up the corporate ladder, whether it's nonprofit or corporate, and become a leader or manager someday, they've had experience with many cohorts of people, which will only enhance their management skills because they'll understand who they are, where they come from, and what challenges they face every day just because of their difference.
Surely. The workforce pipeline, it's now such a challenge that we may not, as and this is not only the U.S. but globally, right? That there's more jobs than there are the workforce to fill those jobs, right? So ensuring that your existing workforce, all segments of your existing workforce, feel valued and are fully engaged and are being upskilled is critical, right? Because it may be difficult to find any replacements. So absolutely, that resource, that asset is mission critical. In certain sectors, right, whether it's retail, consumer sectors, they've moved down this path by necessity faster, right? For those other sectors where you may not have a diverse leadership structure or senior management structure, as they're contemplating ERGs or BRGs or putting them into place, allyship is so important, right? So what guidance might you suggest for those companies where senior leaders are looking into this, but they feel not as comfortable because they're not from some of those diverse sectors?
Understand your audience, speak their language, and show them how it will positively impact their bottom line. Those are the three things that work with executives. When they're convinced that they're going to grow their business because they engage in these efforts, they will get on board. And it's only through that they usually will open their minds to this initiative. Later, as they start to experience the ERGs, then they start to open their hearts and they start to offer even more support. That's why it's so incredibly important that you have an executive as a sponsor of an ERG. Whether they're the same background or a different background, it really doesn't matter, because they're going to learn so much about the employees in that group through their own personal stories and experiences that pretty soon you're developing these wonderful relationships. You're getting exposure to these executives that are decision makers. It often helps these employees with their careers, mentorship, advancement, opportunities. So there's a win-win for both the executives as well as the employees.
Fantastic. And when we think of some common challenges organizations face when implementing ERGs and BRGs, how would you frame some of these challenges, and how could they overcome these types of challenges?
I can go back to my experience at AT&T in the 80s. I remember trying to grow our chapter, and because I was in the Latino chapter, and some of my colleagues who were Latino say, oh no, I don't want to get involved in that, because they almost saw it as an activist organization, or they were going to stand out and they just really wanted to blend in. They wanted to assimilate, not really acculturate. And, they just didn't want attention on their difference. And it wasn't until they started to realize that what we were doing was really going to help all of us in our careers, all of us in our personal lives, all of us contribute more to our family and our family's well-being, that they started to join the group. So that's one of the first things, is really positioning it as a value added to their lives, and not as a you're going to be labeled as an activist if you join this group. So that's probably one of the first challenges that you will face with some of the ERGs. Another challenge is funding. I mean, employees put a lot of time into planning events and planning educational opportunities for their members, and planning get-togethers so that they can have meetings. They have to pay for a space sometimes. They have to pay for food sometimes. They may even have to pay for transportation sometimes. So really finding ways to fund those needs. And some of the ways of funding can come from the organization, but the other ways can come from the group themselves in doing some creative fundraising. So those are some challenges that they will face, and depending on what kind of support they get, they will have to work through those in order to keep their group viable. And I think the last piece, which is probably the most important piece, is that you have buy-in from leadership. And I don't mean just the executive level, because you can have buy-in at the top, but middle management can sometimes block that. As you know, with many organizations, I've done a lot of DEI assessments with organizations, and I remember one in particular. It was with the University of Colorado, and what I found was that the entry level and the executive level were in lockstep with each other as far as vision, values, and goals. It was middle management that was blocking the progress of the organization. And that was interesting to discover. So a lot of work had to be around how do we touch these attitudes in a way that will positively impact their actions.
Oh, great points. Great points. Cecilia, thank you so much. It was such a treat to have this conversation about such an important topic with you. So again, thank you so much, Cecilia. Dario, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Guido and Cecilia, for sharing insights on participating in an ERG, best practices, and allyship. Now, Cecilia, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate your perspective and expertise, and I look forward to our next episode where we will delve deeper into this topic with both Cecilia and Guido as they continue the conversation. Until next time.